Hello, everyone, and welcome to what will be a fairly brief rundown of the Payment Protection Program. I'm joined today by an enrolled agent with Jeff Johnson Accounting, Nick Wiemers, who's going to be the one to really break down this information, make it easy to follow, and answer some common questions that we've heard from around the community. We're recording this over Zoom, and it's our first time ever doing something like this, so we're learning and we're hoping to avoid technical difficulties, but as you know with technology, we can easily run into them. So just know that we're doing our best, and we thank you for being here. We're hoping this will be helpful. So Nick, thank you very much for joining me, and I will let you start talking.
Well, thanks a lot for having me, Parker. I do have to start off with a warning to everyone that there is a lot going on with this program, and it's tough to do it justice in just 10 or 15 minutes. What I tried to do here is put together a very surface level presentation to give you an idea of what this program is. So of course, there's a lot of information I did not include, so you need to thoroughly evaluate your own situation and be sure you're handling this correctly. This overview is not legal, tax, financial, or other advice, and things are changing so rapidly right now that as soon as more information is released, parts of this can become outdated. So the first thing I'll talk about is what the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, is. This is a little piece of the 880-page CARES Act that was signed into law on March 27th of this year. It expands the SBA's 7A loan program. So while this program is administered by the SBA, the loans are actually issued through approved SBA lenders. I believe I've heard that all of our local Pocahontas banks are approved to process these loans, but don't quote me on that. These are 100% federally guaranteed loans for small businesses and self-employed individuals that are facing economic stress due to the COVID-19 situation. $349 billion have been allocated to the program, and it is on a first-come, first-served basis. Now, a lot of people right now are worried about the money running out, but everything that I've read recently indicates that the government is going to step up and continue to fund this program. A couple days ago, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin tweeted, since all official business is done on Twitter now, apparently, that an additional $250 billion was in the works for this program. But of course, that has met some political friction. So at this point, we really don't know what is going to come from that. I expect to hear more about this shortly, and it sounds like it might actually be part of this phase 4 relief that they're talking about. Now, the big part of this Paycheck Protection Program is that all or part of the loan can actually be forgiven, and I'll talk more about that here in a little bit. The loan terms for the unforgiven portion are 2-year terms at 1% interest and no payments for 6 months after the disbursement, although interest will continue to accrue. So definitely some favorable loan terms here, even without the forgiveness piece. And then the deadline for applications to be processed is June 30th of 2020. Now, in terms of eligibility, generally businesses must have 500 or fewer employees. The business had to be operating on February 15th of 2020 and either paid salaries and payroll taxes for employees or paid independent contractors reported on Form 1099 miscellaneous. Now, that definition makes it sound like self-employed individuals with no employees are not eligible, but the law makes it clear that they are. So we're going to need more guidance on the self-employed situations, as there are a lot of unanswered questions. The other thing you need to be aware of is that the borrower will need to make multiple certifications under the penalty of perjury, and one of which is that the current economic uncertainty makes the loan necessary to support ongoing operations. While there aren't certain tests you have to meet to prove that, just keep in mind that if you're not actually being hurt by these economic conditions, you're not eligible for this program.
And Nick, jumping in just to clarify, as you said earlier, there's a lot of stuff moving and changing with this program. And so self-employment situations are one of those things you expect to change, right?
You're exactly right. And that's why I don't want to spend too much time talking about that part of it today, um, because ultimately things are going to change. So hopefully it's all going to work out well, and self-employed people are going to be fully eligible, but we just don't have the guidance right now to talk a whole lot about it. So I've kind of been explaining this program to my clients by breaking it down into two pieces. The first is the application for the loan, and the second is the application for forgiveness. Now, the application for the loan is completed through your bank, and the maximum loan amount is calculated by taking the average monthly payroll cost times 2.5. Now, average monthly payroll costs can be calculated by using the prior 12 months or the 2019 calendar year. And there are also different calculations for seasonal employers and those that were not in business yet between February 15th, 2019 and July 31st, 2019. So what's included for payroll costs? We've got salary, wages, commissions, cash tips, health insurance, retirement benefits, state tax assessed on the employee compensation. And for self-employed people, it's going to be net earnings from self-employment for what we can tell at this point. Um, there is, however, a caveat here that payroll costs are capped at 100% for each employee or for the self-employed individual. And we actually just got guidance here recently that the $100,000 cap is just for wages. So you can still use the health insurance and retirement costs on top of that 100%. Now, the second piece to this is the application for forgiveness. Now, the amount of forgiveness will depend on the borrower's payroll costs over an 8-week period that begins with the first disbursement of the loan. Loan amounts will be forgiven as long as the loan proceeds are used to cover payroll costs, most mortgage interest, rent, and utility costs. Employee levels must be maintained, and employee compensation must also be maintained. Now, the forgiveness amount will be decreased if you laid off an employee or reduced pay. And finally, 75% of the loan proceeds have to be used for payroll costs. Interesting to note that the SBA also states that if any of the PPP funds are used for unauthorized purposes, the SBA will require the borrower to repay the loan, and the borrower may be subject to additional liability, such as charges for fraud. So when we get to that point, the application for forgiveness will be completed with your lender, and the lender has 60 days to make a decision on that application. You will need to provide documentation for the qualified expenses that you paid, such as payroll tax filings, canceled checks, receipts, bank statements, etc. Again, this is just going to depend on what that individual bank requires. More guidance will be coming on the forgiveness aspect.
And Nick, even though the government is funding this program, the application process and the institution that businesses are working with are their local banks, correct?
You're absolutely right. You do need to work with a bank on this. And actually, I'm going to go off on a little tangent here, but I want to say a big thank you to all of our community bankers out there that have been stepping up to serve local businesses during this time. I mean, they're working around the clock to try to figure out how in the world to comply with these programs and serve their customers. So do me a favor, when you do work with your banker, be patient with them. They've got a lot going on, and be sure to thank them for their help. So the SBA has delegated a lot of authority to the individual lenders. So as I've mentioned, different banks are going to require different types of documentation. But in general, what I'm seeing so far is you should be ready to produce your 2019 and 2020 year-to-date detailed payroll reports that include health and retirement benefits, 2019 and 2020 year-to-date filed payroll tax filings, such as 941s, 944s, your 2019 and 2020 year-to-date profit and loss, and articles of incorporation and bylaws if you're applying as an entity. If you're self-employed, we're still unsure what the SBA is going to require. I'm guessing it's at minimum going to be a copy of your tax return, including your Schedule C or Schedule F. So I do have a few final thoughts I want to share with you before we have a little Q&A session. First is that we don't know what the tax implications of this program will be. They have come out and said that the forgiveness itself is not taxable, but what's unclear at this point is whether you'll be able to deduct any expenses that are paid by the forgiven portion of the loan. So if it were me, I would plan to treat the forgiven loan amount as taxable income at this point. But it's very important that you discuss this with your tax advisor before the end of 2020, as we'll hopefully have more guidance by then. We can figure out how it'll affect you and how we can plan for it. Now, my last point is to keep in mind that this program is still a loan. Personally, I don't see any reasons that the forgiveness wouldn't end up happening if you check all the boxes. But remember that the federal government is the federal government. There are probably going to be some changes to this program that we just aren't expecting now. So I think we'll end this with a few questions and answers. Like I mentioned before, most of your specific questions will need to be answered by your banker. And since I thanked him earlier, I think I can pawn everything off on the bankers now, right?
Absolutely.
So if you do have any questions for me, please shoot me an email. Our phones are just a little too busy this time of year to take calls. So I put my email address up on the screen again. I will get back to you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Parker for any questions that were asked of him.
Yeah, so I've had just a few community members share questions they have about the program, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll pick just a couple questions to keep this short, and the rest, if you have any questions that weren't addressed, like we said, feel free to send them to Nick at the email that is listed on the slide currently, or on this video. So the first question that I have here is, I'm confused by the application and documents the bank is asking for. Who can help me apply?
Sure. So this application process can be overwhelming. But I think the first thing you should do is just slow down and try to thoroughly complete the application. I think everybody's just trying to get this done as fast as possible because they're afraid the money is going to run out. But it's really important that you take your time with this. Give it a shot on your own. And then since different banks are going to be handling things differently, ask your lender the specific questions you have on the application or specific questions about the documents the bank is requesting.
All right. And the next question that we have is, I've heard of other programs like economic disaster loans and an employee retention credit. Which is best for me?
So that's probably all just going to come down to the specific situation. From what I've seen, that PPP loan looks like a more favorable program for a lot of businesses. Those other programs are outside the scope of this presentation, but they are worth spending some time looking into. There's a lot of resources online for each of those programs. Just be aware that there are instances where you're not eligible for both programs. Like, for example, you can't receive a PPP loan and the employer retention credit.
All right. Thank you, Nick. And that was the last question that we're going to have time for today. I want to thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm glad that we could make this work with Nick and Jeff Johnson Accounting to give us their time. And hopefully some of you have found this video to be useful. You can keep contacting us with questions. Remember to ask your local banker and to thank them for all that they're doing during this crazy time. If there's other topics that you would like broken down into a video like this, feel free to reach out to me, Parker Aiden, and we can maybe see about what we can do to make that work. And Nick, thank you very much for joining us and giving us your insights tonight.
You're very welcome. And thanks, Parker and the Chamber, for putting all this together. And thanks to everybody who tuned in.